Chapter 1, Hamilton, Ontario. Michelle and I decided to live prayerfully for an entire year. It was a nice, shiny idea. But where should we start? With For Dummies, obviously. I borrowed a copy of Christian Prayer for Dummies from the library. The cover was so enticing. Find your own prayer style. Explanations in plain English. Get in, get out information. Icons and other navigational aids. Tear out cheat sheets. That last one was really important. I would hate to pray without cheating. I flipped to the cheat sheet. The cheat sheet included items like incorporate Christian prayer into your life in 3 weeks and how to hear God's voice during Christian prayer. But I was skeptical. This book was published in 2003. A lot has changed since then. Would it still work today? I didn't have a landline anymore. Surely the Almighty had updated his contact methods too. Was he an Apple or an Android guy? I was also suspicious of the book's author. According to his For Dummies author page, the author had created 14 For Dummies products, including Christianity for Dummies, Christian Prayer for Dummies, and Yahoo Site Builder for Dummies, which compelled me to ask, did Yahoo still exist? Page 1. Right in the middle, boxed and bolded, I read this disclaimer. The advice and strategies contained herein may not be suitable for your situation. You should consult with a professional where appropriate. This left me with all sorts of questions, such as when exactly would be an appropriate time to consult a professional. Wasn't that why I was reading this book in the first place? Where did one find a prayer professional? What precisely is a prayer professional? I grabbed a dictionary and found this definition for the word professional. Following an occupation as a means of living or for gain, a professional builder. Clearly, I needed to find someone who got paid to pray. I googled prayer professional and it produced 44,300,000 results in 0.2 seconds, but they all appeared pretty fruitless. Well, not entirely. I found a prayer request from a consultant that read, I request prayer for my trip to Denver July 9 to 20 to be safe and successful and to achieve my goal of 32 net sales at net volume of $22,500. So that was something. I changed my web query to prayer consultant, which produced much better results. Using LinkedIn, I connect with a prayer consultant named Don Pearson. Don's actual title is Prayer Strategy Specialist, which sounded impressive. I scheduled a phone call with him for the next day. Quote, prayer is like a greased pig at a country fair, often pursued but rarely grasped. Christian Prayer for Dummies. With Don's call a day away, I had plenty of time to consult Christian Prayer for Dummies. I skimmed through the table of contents, and I'll be honest, I skipped directly to chapter 17. Ask and it shall be given. I'd like a Porsche, please. I was disappointed to discover that you actually have to read the context of a Bible verse if you want your prayers to work. I also learned that Italian sports cars weren't around when the Bible's original manuscripts were written, so it might be better to ask for a chariot or a donkey, which gets better mileage anyway. One thing caught my eye. The health benefits of prayer. Number 1. You double your chances of successful in vitro pregnancy if you're prayed for. Number 2. Heart attack survivors recover quicker if they're being prayed for by someone. Number 3. Getting people to pray for you gets you out of the hospital faster after you've had an angioplasty. That was great news, to be sure, but maybe the author needed an unregistered surgeon's warning. Prayer isn't a strict cause and effect relationship. Candy junkies can't manipulate God into getting rid of their diabetes. Prayer is not a substitute for healthy eating and daily exercise. I skimmed some more. My favorite line? Hudson Taylor had a lifelong passion to become a Christian missionary to inland China, and not just because he liked Kung Pao chicken. Footnote. I'm sure you realize the obvious untruth of this statement. Taylor arrived in China in 1854, but Kung Pao chicken didn't arrive until 1866. After the author called the Lord's Prayer the original Christian Prayer for Dummies, I called it quits, returning the book to the library where I assumed it would remain until the next Friends of the Library book sale. Quote, the Lord sustains him on his sickbed. In his illness you restore him to full health. Psalm 41:3. Prayer strategy specialist Don Pearson is the prayer point man for a denomination in Tennessee, a member of the staff who literally gets paid to pray. A former pastor, church planter, and missionary, he's been around the block. Having been on the prayer job for 13 years, he has no idea how one lands such a job. I get asked that a lot, he told me. All I know is I have a calling based on Hosea 10:12. Sow righteousness for yourself, reap the fruit of unfailing love, and break up your unplowed ground. For this is the time to seek the Lord, until he comes and showers his righteousness on you. I'm here to break up fallow ground. He informed me that one can get a master's degree in prayer, but that no one has offered a doctorate yet. Probably so that no televangelist could start a show called The Prayer Doctor. Don has 3,197 churches under his wing, and he spends his time leading retreats, revivals, classes, concerts of prayer, and assemblies. He helps pastors develop strategies to unify their churches for spiritual awakening, and he preaches almost every day. The guy is a spiritual mover and shaker. He gets stuff done. Don was heading out to a meeting as we spoke, and I could hear him driving while talking on his cell phone. I quickly prayed for his safety. Don told me there are 3 types of prayer. Crisis prayer is the most popular of the 3. Such prayers are urgent, earthly, and temporal. The help me pass this test, please heal my neighbor, fix my marriage kind of prayers that we all pray. Then there are calling prayers. The prayers of Paul were dominated by calling, especially in Colossians 4. Paul had received a word from God, a very clear direction and purpose, and it trumped every circumstance. Paul was in prison, but he prayed for boldness instead of rescue or escape. His calling was greater than his crisis. When he prayed for others, he prayed for their character in spite of present circumstances. Then there are kingdom prayers. Don doesn't believe that we create these prayers, but that kingdom prayers come from the King. These are prayers like Jesus' prayer to send more workers into the harvest field. Kingdom prayers are bigger than any one person, denomination, or time in history. Don believes his job is to help people move from crisis to calling to kingdom prayer. Crisis prayer has always consumed our churches, he said. The number of lost people is increasing, but all we're praying about is colds and cancer. He continued, I want to see transformation. I pray that people will return to God and begin to pray the way He wants us to pray. Most new believers pray calling and kingdom prayers, but I've noticed a disturbing trend in older believers. They pray mostly crisis prayers. I gave him a loud and hoped he didn't realize I was one of those people. So how do we reverse this trend, Don? If your heart is consumed with kingdom and calling, you pray differently. When you seek first the kingdom, the other things don't concern you. He asked me if I was married, and I said yes. If you don't talk to your wife, your relationship will get sick. You'll never know each other's hearts and wills, and it's the same way with God. You can't do His will if you can't hear His voice. Every religion prays. What makes our prayers any different? God speaks back. God doesn't need us to talk to Him, but one word from Him changes us. Prayer is about us hearing from God. Suddenly I felt uncomfortable. The words sounded familiar. I once heard a talk by Erwin McManus when he asked, how do you know if you're a Christian? You know you're a Christian because you know the sound of His voice. Now Dom was saying the same thing. Problem was, I'd never audibly heard from God. I'd never even had an overwhelming spiritual experience. I'm a rational thinker. I like to process and ponder and write. Don't get me wrong, I really want to hear from God, but is it even possible for someone like me? So Don, I asked hesitantly, how do I hear from God? You know, Jared, it's a still, small voice. The more time you spend with Him, the less you'll ask that question. You'll begin to recognize the sound of His whisper. Aside from his full-time day job as a prayer warrior, Don also spends about 45 minutes a day with God on his own. He doesn't have a set schedule or plan. He just reads the Bible until God speaks, then journals about it, and then he prays it back to God. The next day, he picks up where he left off. I asked Don if he ever heard any really good answers to prayer. Oh yes, every day, he replied. Last week we had an incredible answer to prayer. There's a girl in one of our churches. She grew up in the church, went on mission trips, great kid. She started dating this guy who was far from God and eventually married him. Now she's far from God. I knew where this was going. In December, the husband thought he had stomach cancer. No doctor had diagnosed him. He just really believed he had stomach cancer. So he put a shotgun to his stomach and pulled the trigger. Okay, I didn't see that one coming. Somehow, he survived the trip to the hospital, but the doctors didn't think he'd make it. The church started praying for his salvation. Not for his healing, for his salvation. The church commissioned their pastor to lead this man to Christ. The pastor goes to the hospital and leads him to Christ on the spot. And wouldn't you believe it? The man makes a miraculous recovery. Fast forward a few months. The guy is home, and the pastor calls him up and says he wants to start a Bible study in the man's home. The pastor tells the man to invite all his unsaved friends and family. So he does. 30 people show up the first night. The man's parents and sister now drive 3 hours each way to attend every week. They've been going for 5 weeks now, and already several of them have gotten saved and baptized. These are the kind of stories I want to be able to tell. This is the kind of faith I want to have, living in the midst of a community of people who have prayed with greater power than the brute force of a shotgun. But how can I tap into what Don has in prayer? How can I hear God's still, small voice? What will it look like in my life without having to be a prayer strategy specialist? In true prayer expert style, Don ended our conversation by praying. He prayed for Michelle and me that our journey of prayer would be fruitful, that God would open doors of opportunity, and that we'd learn to pray more and more calling and kingdom prayers. He prayed that I would find what I was looking for. I hung up the phone and hummed a little U2.